What if the borders of the Middle East were not drawn to create nations, but to stop a train? What if the wars, the oil crises, and the chaos we see today all trace back to a single iron road that was never finished? Stay with me, because what you are about to hear will permanently change the way you look at history, maps, and the world. Most of us were taught that the First World War started because a young man fired 2 shots in Sarajevo, and the dominoes of alliance fell until Europe was consumed by fire. That is the version taught to children. It is clean, it is simple, and it leaves out almost everything that actually mattered. The truth is buried deeper, and it smells of coal smoke, desert sand, and oil. To find it, you have to go back to a map of the world in the year 1900. And you have to look at what truly made the most powerful empire on earth lose sleep at night. It was not a cannon. It was not a fleet. It was a railway. This is the story of the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, one of the most consequential and least understood infrastructure projects. It is the story of an empire trying to save itself, a rising nation trying to break free from a cage, and a dominant power willing to burn everything down to protect its grip on the world. And it is a story that is far from over. To understand why a train line could terrify the most powerful empire, you first have to understand how that empire worked. The British Empire at the turn of the 20th century was not simply large. It was a machine built around control of movement. Control the seas, and you control who trades with whom. Control the choke points, and you control the destiny of nations. The Royal Navy was the fist. The Suez Canal in Egypt was the spine. As long as Britain held Suez, every merchant ship wanting to reach India, China, or the Far East had to pass through. India alone generated so much wealth that losing it would have meant the slow death of the entire empire. Suez was the lock. At the same time, in the heart of Europe, something new and dangerous was taking shape. Germany had unified in 1871. Within a single generation, it transformed itself into an industrial giant. German factories were producing steel, chemicals, and machinery that rivaled or surpassed anything Britain could make. German universities were training the finest scientists and engineers. German ambition was enormous, but German power had a ceiling, and that ceiling was geography. Germany sat in the middle of the continent, surrounded by rivals, and cut off from the open oceans by the British fleet. Germany had no vast colonies to supply cheap raw materials. It had no reliable access to the markets of Asia or the Middle East. For all its industrial muscle, Germany was economically boxed in. It was a tiger in a very elegant cage. To the southeast lay a dying empire with a problem of its own. The Ottoman Empire had once stretched from Vienna to the Persian Gulf. For centuries, it had been one of the dominant forces, but by the late 19th century, the cracks had become chasms. Territory had been lost in the Balkans. The army was outdated and underfunded, and worst of all, the empire was drowning in debt. The Ottoman government had borrowed heavily from British and French banks to fund its modernization efforts and its wars, and when it could no longer pay, the consequences were humiliating. In 1881, the empire was effectively declared bankrupt. As part of the settlement, the Ottoman government was forced to hand over control of large portions of its own tax revenues to a body run by European creditors. This organization, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, was staffed by foreign bankers, who collected taxes directly from Ottoman citizens. When a Turkish farmer sold his tobacco or his grain, the money did not flow to the Sultan. It flowed to bank vaults in London and Paris. The empire had lost sovereignty over its own economy without a single battle being fought. Sultan Abdul Hamid II understood exactly what was happening. He was watching his empire being consumed from the inside by the very powers that smiled at him in diplomatic halls. He needed a way out. He needed roads and railways to modernize his country, move his armies, and hold his vast territory together. But he knew that asking Britain or France to build those railways would only deepen the trap. Every mile of track they laid would come with conditions, with debt, with leverage. He needed a different partner. This is where the ambitions of Germany and the desperation of the Ottoman Empire found each other in the most consequential handshake. Kaiser Wilhelm II saw what others had missed. If Germany could build a railway connecting Berlin southward through Vienna and the Balkans, into Constantinople, and then extending all the way southeast across Anatolia, through the mountains and deserts of the Middle East, down to Baghdad and ultimately to the Persian Gulf, the geometry of global trade would be transformed overnight. Think about what that actually meant. A train loaded with German industrial goods could leave Berlin and travel overland, all the way to the shores of the Indian Ocean without crossing a single stretch of water patrolled by the Royal Navy. The British stranglehold on global shipping lanes would be broken. Germany would have a direct overland corridor to the resources and markets of Asia and the Middle East. For the Sultan, the railway meant something equally powerful. It meant being able to move soldiers from the capital to the furthest corners of the empire in days rather than months. It meant economic development without British or French strings attached. It meant, perhaps, a genuine chance at survival. Construction began with German financing and German engineers at the helm. Deutsche Bank took the lead in organizing the capital. The engineering challenges were staggering. The railway had to cross the Taurus and Amanus mountain ranges in southern Turkey. Ranges that required tunnels blasted through sheer rock at enormous expense and danger. It had to traverse scorching desert plains, where the heat alone could kill a man. Progress was slow and brutally expensive, but it continued. And as the tracks inched eastward, the mood in London shifted from discomfort to alarm. British strategic planners looked at the proposed route and saw a weapon pointed directly at the heart of their empire. A completed railway would allow German commercial goods to undercut British merchants in the markets of India and the Middle East. German military advisors, already embedded with the Ottoman army, could use the railway to project force toward Egypt and Suez. But there was one additional element that transformed British concern into something closer to panic, and that element was oil. At the turn of the 20th century, oil was beginning to replace coal as the defining fuel of modern power. The Royal Navy was converting its fleet from coal-burning to oil-burning engines. Oil allowed warships to travel faster, stay at sea longer, and be refueled far more efficiently. Admiral John Fisher made it plain that the future of British naval supremacy depended on secure access to oil. But Britain had no oil of its own. It relied on supplies from Persia and from the United States, both with strategic vulnerabilities. And then geologists began to report something extraordinary about the land through which the Baghdad Railway would pass. The ancient territory of Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers that we know today as Iraq. Beneath that flat, sun-baked ground lay what may have been the largest untapped reserves of oil on Earth. The Germans had negotiated mineral rights for 20 kilometers on either side of the railway track. If the line was finished, Germany would control not just a trade route, but the tap of the fuel on which the future of global warfare depended. The British establishment decided at the highest levels that this could not be allowed to happen. The response was multi-layered and relentless. Diplomatically, British agents approached the Sheikh of Kuwait, the small territory at the southern end of the proposed railway route, where a Persian Gulf terminal was planned. The Sheikh was persuaded to sign a secret agreement with Britain, promising not to lease any land to foreign powers, without British approval. With that stroke of a pen, the railway was left pointing toward the sea with nowhere to dock. It was a checkmate delivered in a quiet room, far from any battlefield. The British press was mobilized to paint the project in the darkest possible terms. German involvement was portrayed as sinister imperialism. The Ottomans were described in terms that dehumanized them and justified keeping them weak. The City of London, the financial center of the world, quietly closed its doors to any investment in the railway. British capital would not help build a road to its own undoing. But the Germans kept building. By 1914, the tracks had crawled through western and central Anatolia and were approaching the mountain passes of the south. The project was incomplete, but no longer theoretical. The threat was becoming tangible. It was in this atmosphere, charged with economic rivalry and strategic fear, that the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo provided the spark that the great powers had been unconsciously preparing for. The war that followed was not simply about national pride or the tragedy of entangled alliances. It was a war about who would control the next century. Britain, France, and Russia had been maneuvering for years to encircle Germany and arrest its expansion. Russia coveted Ottoman territory and feared a strengthened Ottoman state. France feared German economic dominance. Britain feared for India and Suez. The assassination gave everyone a reason to stop pretending that peace was still the goal. For the Ottoman Empire, the choice of which side to join was agonizing. Some leaders believed that aligning with Germany offered the only realistic hope of freedom. A German victory might cancel the crushing debt to British and French banks. German guns and supplies could help retake territories lost in Egypt and the Caucasus. The railway, if the war went well, might finally be finished. It was a gamble, and like all great gambles made by desperate men, it ended in catastrophe. The British did not wait to see how the war in Europe developed before acting in the Middle East. Within weeks of the Ottoman Empire entering the war, a British expeditionary force was dispatched to Basra at the southern tip of Mesopotamia. The official justification was protecting the oil refinery at Abadan across the border in Persia. The real logic was the railway and the oil fields to the north. The British were racing to occupy the ground before the Germans could use it. The campaign in Mesopotamia was a nightmare of heat, disease, and logistical failure. British forces suffered one of the most humiliating defeats in the history of the empire, when an entire army was surrounded and forced to surrender at Kut in 1916. But Britain had resources it could draw on indefinitely, while the Ottomans were stretched to breaking point. The railway that was supposed to transform Ottoman military capacity was still unfinished. There were critical gaps through the mountain passes in southern Turkey, where the hardest tunneling remained undone. Supplies from Germany had to be unloaded from trains, hauled over the mountains by animal and truck, and reloaded on the other side. That bottleneck strangled the Ottoman war effort at its most critical moment. If those tunnels had been completed even 3 or 4 years earlier, the history of the entire region might have unfolded differently. Instead, British forces regrouped, received reinforcements, and eventually pushed north, capturing Baghdad in 1917 and Jerusalem not long after. While the fighting continued, British and French diplomats were already dividing the spoils. In 1916, two men named Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot sat down with a map of the Middle East and drew lines with a pencil. They were not drawing borders to reflect the communities and cultures and histories of the people who lived there. They were drawing borders to ensure that no single power could ever again threaten their dominance of the region. When you lay the Sykes-Picot map over a map of the Baghdad railway route and the known oil deposits of the era, the correspondence is almost exact. Britain claimed the territory that would become Iraq and a slice of Palestine, including the port of Haifa. France claimed Syria and Lebanon. They were carving the region not for the benefit of its people, but to control the corridor and the oil beneath it. The betrayal of the Arab peoples who had been promised independence in exchange for revolting against the Ottomans was total. A British officer known to history as Lawrence of Arabia had led and encouraged those revolts, promising that Arab unity and freedom would follow the end of Ottoman rule. Those promises dissolved the moment the war ended. The Arabs received not independence, but a new set of European masters wearing different uniforms. The Ottoman Empire was dissolved entirely. The caliphate that had given spiritual authority to the Muslim world for centuries was abolished. The debt the empire had owed to European banks was not forgiven. It was restructured and handed to the new nations carved from the ruins, nations whose borders had been drawn by foreign hands in foreign capitals. The railway was cut into fragments. Different sections now lay in what became Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, each under different administration, each divided by customs checkpoints and competing currencies. The unified trade route it was designed to be never existed. The Silk Road of Steel, as some had imagined it, was dead before it was born. The effects of these decisions did not stay in 1918. They reverberated through the entire 20th century and continue to echo today. The colonial powers that inherited the Middle East had a problem with the oil they had seized. They needed pipelines to move it to the coast. Those pipelines followed almost exactly the same strategic logic as the old railway, threading across the same landscape, connecting the same oil fields to the same Mediterranean ports. But pipelines only carry oil. They do not carry passengers. They do not carry ideas. They do not build the kind of economic integration that could make the region powerful and self-sufficient. That was the point. The colonial order preferred a Middle East that was divided and dependent, not united and strong. During the Second World War, the same geography became contested again. German ambitions in North Africa and the Caucasus were fundamentally about oil and the overland routes that connected Europe to it. British forces invaded Iraq a second time to secure the oil fields and the transport corridors. History was not merely repeating itself, it was insisting. When the British Empire finally exhausted itself in the aftermath of that Second War, the United States inherited its strategic obsessions, along with its responsibilities. American policy in the Middle East throughout the Cold War and beyond has been shaped by the same underlying anxiety that tormented British planners in 1900. Control the corridor, secure the oil, prevent any rival power from dominating the Eurasian heartland. The specific enemy changed from Germany to the Soviet Union to a rotating cast of regional challengers, but the map never changed. And now, in the 21st century, we are watching what may be the most direct repetition of this entire story. China has built the largest economy in the world and faces a strategic vulnerability that will feel familiar to anyone who has followed this history. The United States Navy controls the shipping lanes of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. In a serious conflict, those lanes could be closed to Chinese trade, cutting off the energy and raw materials on which Chinese industry depends. The Chinese response has been to build overland infrastructure, railways and pipelines and highways stretching across Central Asia and the Middle East, connecting China to Europe and to the Persian Gulf without crossing water controlled by American ships. The project is called the Belt and Road Initiative, and when you place its map over a map of the old Baghdad Railway, expanded to a continental scale, the strategic logic is identical. The response from Washington has also been eerily familiar. Chinese infrastructure projects in developing countries are described as debt traps. Chinese technology companies are accused of creating security vulnerabilities. Warnings are issued to nations that accept Chinese investment. The language has updated itself, but the strategic anxiety underneath it has not changed in 100 years. The story of the Berlin to Baghdad Railway teaches something that is uncomfortable and important. Infrastructure is never neutral. A road is never simply a road. A railway is never simply a way to move goods. These things are vectors of power, and the powers that already dominate the world will go to extraordinary lengths, including war, to prevent rivals from building connections that could undermine that dominance. The Middle East became a permanent battlefield, not because of ancient hatreds, not because of religion, not because its people are somehow incapable of peace, but because it sits at the intersection of the most strategically valuable corridors on Earth, and because the great powers of every generation have refused to leave it alone. The Ottoman sultans believed they could invite German capital and German engineers into their empire while keeping their independence. They thought they could play powerful rivals against each other and come out ahead. Instead, they became a theater of war between those same rivals, and their empire was destroyed and divided precisely along the lines that the great powers had always intended. Many developing nations today face a version of that same choice, a hunger for development on one side and the competing pressures of great power competition on the other. The lesson of the Baghdad Railway is that choosing the wrong patron can be more dangerous than having no patron at all. When you look at the map of the modern Middle East and ask how those borders came to be, the answer is not found in the ancient rivalries of its peoples. It is found in a conversation between two diplomats with a pencil and a map in 1916. It is found in the calculations of British strategists who looked at a half-finished German railway and decided that the only safe outcome was to make sure no one could ever finish it. It is found in the rusting tracks buried under desert sand that were supposed to carry a civilization forward, and instead marked the line along which that civilization was cut apart. The train that never arrived is still shaping the world. The borders it helped create are still contested. The oil fields it was built to reach are still at the center of conflicts that kill people every year. And the great game of infrastructure and choke points and overland corridors is being played again right now, on an even larger scale, by different players who have apparently not read enough history to know how the last round ended. That is not a reason for despair. It is a reason to pay attention. The people who understand these patterns before they fully unfold are the ones who can make sense of what they see, who can ask better questions, and who can resist the simplified stories that powerful interests tell about why wars happen and who is to blame. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes so consistently that those who listen carefully can hear what is coming before it arrives. The Iron Road was never finished, but its ghost is everywhere. Thanks for watching. History doesn't wait for permission. It rewards those who see it coming. Subscribe and stay ahead.